Jai Baba. I seem to be thinking a lot more these days, increasingly, over Baba as a man, as he was when I was with him, in his you could say in his man form, and it reminded me of with Erich, after a darshan program, Baba would say to Erich, "How was it?" And Erich would say, "How wonderful it was. You were glorious, and people loved it, and they responded." And at the same time, while he was saying that, he was as he said, I was always aware of how he really was. When the darshan program was finished, and Baba was taken from the platform behind a door, and how he'd have to be helped, put in a chair for a while, recover. And this happened, Erich would say, a number of times, and finally he said to Baba, it sort of got to him, this dichotomy. And he said, "Baba, how is it? We know what you really like. We know what you're really going through, what your body is. But at the darshan programs, you look so wonderful, so glory, shining." And Baba said, "Yes, that is your lot, to look after me in my physical form. And those who live with me, that's what they experience. Those who come from afar and be with me, what they see is my divinity. But when I drop the body, those that come then will seek more of my physical side, knowledge of me physically, and you through them will experience my divinity." And that reminded me of a letter that Baba wrote to a Western woman in 1940, and it's just so applicable, and it meant a great deal to me, and as I go on, more and more. "The gift of understanding is more precious than any other attribute of love." On 10th March, Baba wrote, "Your last letter ticked me off for tempering or balancing my eternal suffering with eternal bliss, while humanity has to suffer without the joy of infinite bliss and happiness, implying, was it fair? Darling Shalimar, I want you to be always outspoken and free with your beloved. I know you love, but imperfectly as yet. Hence your lack of understanding. The avatar has to suffer eternally for the world. But added to this is the often unnecessary suffering caused by my dearest and chosen ones, just because they do not understand him or his ways. This gift of understanding is more precious than any other attribute of love, be it expressed in service or sacrifice. Love can be blind, selfish, greedy, ignorant, but love with understanding can be none of these things. It is the divine fruit of pure love, the rarest fruit or flower of the universe. It has been called the sweetest flower in all the world. Age cannot wither it. It grows more lovely as it casts off its outer garment, disclosing its unseen beauty within. What a wonderful opportunity to learn that this love with understanding is given to those whom the Beloved, himself the epitome of perfect understanding, calls to live near him. What a tragedy for those who refuse. If they had any understanding of what they had passed over, their suffering would indeed be unbearable. No physical suffering, no suffering of the present war could compare with it. If they had understanding, they never would have refused. How complicated is life? But love cannot force. To serve, please, and love me is a very different thing from what, let us say, Hitler asked of his followers. This is 1940. They obey. If not, they are shot or imprisoned. My followers obey me voluntarily, a far more difficult ideal. Learn eventually you will, but in a school where suffering may not be combined with the presence of eternal bliss and happiness, as it would if you had come to me as I asked. There is so much in you which I need for my work, such capacity to understand, had you the desire to learn and the grit, determination and courage to strive for the goal. Who better than you were able to realize my changing moods, my present need, my unspoken wish? But you grew tired and wanted a change. Like a child, you wanted the fairy palace, the fine jewel, without the climb and toil for its attainment. Now, darling Shalimar, don't be miserable because this time I've ticked you off. Write again soon and tell me all your plans and what you would like to do. You have chosen the longer of two paths toward the happiness you sincerely desire, but it is a path and I will lead you along it to the end. So you have nothing to fear, nothing to worry about. Mine you always were, and mine you will always remain, whether there or here. And that love with understanding is something which I really hit home to me in thinking of Baba and recall how I was when I was with him. And so in the process of thinking about it, I've written something on what I've called simply suffering. And I hope I convey something in the process of reading. Meher Baba has said, the sublime difference in individual suffering lies in the fact that an ordinary man suffers for himself. Masters suffer for humanity, and the avatar suffers for one and all beings and things. He has also said in reference to man, all suffering is his labour of love to unveil his own infinite self. I was brought up on church Christianity and told of Jesus, the Son of God, suffering on the cross to free us from our sins. But the words, the stories, the hours spent listening to sermons from the pulpit always seem remote, not touching deeply the mind, and certainly not the heart. Jesus, in short, remained a figure simply in history, like so many other historical figures. But in some stumbling way, a search for meaning in life and God continued. And in Barber's time, I was introduced to him through his discourses. They hit home. And although I accepted immediately that this being, who had been Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad before him, was to be loved and served, he still remained rather distant. The mind, yes, firmly accepted him as avatar, but not as both God and man, with feeling and a sense of reality in some deeper inner depth of my being. And this applied particularly in reading of his suffering. It just did not penetrate that he, as God, descended into man form of flesh and blood, and in man form suffered as we suffered, but infinitely more. 7 years, 1947, 1954, passed by, and during those years I received news of Barber's activities, particularly of his new life period. And now looking back, I have to confess that the news seemed then too much like chapters of an ongoing book, fascinating as it was. But unconsciously that news and my desire to make my service to him more real made me restless and strengthened my seeking. To my immense good fortune, I was able to travel to India in 1954 and be with this divine being that drew me to him so strongly. How easy it was to live actively intent on absorbing everything of this wondrous being and everything he offered during those 3 weeks of September 1954. Little was I swept away, as it were, emotionally. Yet, yes, I was once intensely moved by the gramophone records of guzzles in his presence. And another time, as he dictated a message, I felt strongly his longing to be completely at home in everyone's heart. Perhaps I could say that those experiences were nearest of an awareness of his suffering in our separation from him. My recollections of beloved Barber's first visit to Australia are basically of joy. He planted, as he said then, a seed of love in this country, and then I felt demonstrated so strongly, yet naturally and kindly, that love, as we should express it in our everyday activities with each other. But in the very beginning of his second visit to Australia, soon after his second car accident, I saw clearly his physical suffering for the first time. I was caught up immediately in his loving presence, and while there was often some awareness of his suffering, it was submerged, as it were, in the subconscious depth of the mind-heart. This was so again during the East-West gathering, and particularly during my stay in Meherazad in 1967. While I was more frequently jolted by his deteriorating physical condition throughout those 14 days in 1967, yet he kept my attention constantly on him, on the state of the Barber work in Australia, and on the work that he now wished me to carry out. And that absorption in his very existence on earth continued over the next 2 years with news of his activities, hope for his further physical contact, his occasional messages of encouragement to me, continue to occupy so much of my conscious life that somehow I never conceived of life without his physical presence. That time came, January 31st, 1969. He physically departed. Erich expressed our need at this time so well. When Baba drops his body, he remains as he is, leaving us now to be by his side. Before dropping his body, he remained present by our side. Now it is for us to be present by his side. His companionship will always be with us. It is for us to become his companion. I endeavoured to do this, and in the process my memories of his suffering became more and more real and painful. Now some particular images of him are etched in my mind, haunting me and intensifying my awareness of what he went through for us, me. At some point during the years, while thus thinking, for example, of the contrast between beloved Baba striding so beautifully across the airport tarmac from the plane in 1956, and his slow walk with his hand on Erich's arm for support in 1958, I again relived the years with Baba and wrote down then some of my thoughts, feelings on Baba's suffering. In reflecting on beloved Baba's suffering as we witnessed here on Avatar's abode in 1958, I realised what a blessing it was for us who were with him and in time to the whole of Australia. Although prior to Baba's visit in 1958, I may have been intellectually aware of God-man's suffering for our redemption. It was seeing him on his arrival in 1958 that made me experience some feeling for his suffering. On his first visit to Australia, he planted the seed of love. And for me, on his second visit, he watered that seed with the inner tears of his suffering to bring about in time the full manifestation of his love in Australia. As I subsequently wrote of that 1958 visit, during that evening with Baba, his arrival, his appearance, his movements, I sensed a little more of an immensity of suffering beyond my reasoning comprehension. Again and again throughout the following days, my mind was thus confronted with and momentarily stilled with awareness of Baba's suffering. He once said, "As your breath ebbs and flows, but is always with you, so is my suffering always with me." The Sufi saying, "When the heart weeps because it has lost, the spirit laughs because it has found," describes the pain and the joy of the lover in this suffering of the beloved. For Baba has said that the suffering of Avatar is in order that all beings and things in creation may awake to the realization of their true state. Baba said, "This Sahavas will be unique in the sense that you will witness and share my present universal suffering by being near me as my fortunate companions, being with the Ancient One who will be at the same time completely on the human level with you. Well, we did witness his suffering. We were there, and surely we felt it. And perhaps for a moment we understood the cry of the lover of God. I cannot stand this pain of longing for you, beloved, yet do not take it away, because it is my very life. But whether his suffering was from the deterioration of his physical veil, or was an expression of his longing to awaken in our hearts, we do not know. We can only testify that his suffering was like a hammer upon our complacency and insensitivity. His suffering enveloped us. And sometimes, too, he was stern and almost fierce. But his very being was loving kindness and compassion, and his every gesture, every word, every expression, shafts of light through the 7 planes of consciousness. He knew precisely our capacity for evaluation and change, and never took us near the limits of our endurance. I saw beloved Baba physically 5 times over the period 1954 to 1967, and while he remained absolutely God and Master, he changed during that period physically in appearance and in outer responsiveness to his creation. For me, during my times with him in 1958, 1962 and 1967, he seemed to be gradually withdrawing more and more from the world, outwardly at least, while his suffering intensified. This seemed particularly so during the 2 weeks I was with him in Meherazad in 1967. As I wrote then, when he laid down that the spiritual path is love and service, he lived this to the hilt, without consideration of the cost to his body. He was the master whip who set a cracking pace for all with him. Now he is broken in health, the lightning hidden behind veils of pain. Now he is master and helpless man at one and the same time. How frail, infinitely weary, infinitely sad, racked by physical infirmities and injuries, stomach ruined by a lifetime of fasts and neglect, and yet how infinitely God in human form, Lord of the universe, contained in illusion in a deteriorating cage. That was how he appeared to me during those 2 weeks. Each day he came to Mundley Hall and sat and listened with infinite patience and kindness, and sometimes enjoyment, to the little songs, queries, complaints, tales of woe, pleadings from his lovers. It is very difficult to write of beloved Baba as I saw him then. But I remember the slow, uneven, and yet not ungraceful walk in the hall before sitting down. The neck brace, the very pale, absolutely white complexion, no colour at all. And the movements in the chair as he sought to ease the pain in his body. He often spoke of not resting well at night, and I would learn that his temperature in the night was 104 degrees. In the morning, 102, yet he would come, saying, I came because of Avatar's abode and because Bill is here. I noted on another day his words, I'm infinitely tired. I've put my heart into Avatar's abode, and now it has told upon my health. Yet he made the day, the work, the atmosphere so very natural. I forgot his condition. He was simply the master at work in his office. The concentration on the work, not on him. Yet he was central to the day. As though I existed only because of him. He became the pivot of my existence on that day in that setting, and no one else mattered unless he drew attention to one of the others. But to return to the Sahabas of 1958, I'm sure that by his grace, not only each participant in that Sahabas, but indeed all who have over the years committed themselves to him, have been given some suffering to help us remember him and free himself in us, at least to a small degree. It all depends upon the extent we open ourselves to him. And while we are going through the suffering, we may not like it or welcome it, and may even complain. But later, in reflecting on the experience, we realise what a blessing it has been. And we thank Baba for it. I recall Dr. Donkin's words when he was asked what he had gained from his many years with Meher Baba. It is not what I have gained, but what I have lost in the form of useless mental baggage. I can so heartily agree with him. But to loose that useless mental baggage is not easy. And while it is clear that it is only by his grace the baggage may gradually disappear, and that grace also includes his support, which is always there, as we work through the suffering to gain enlightenment from it. His compassion may be hidden, but it is always available. As illustrated in the figure of the clay potter. In the old days, Erich would take us on a tour of Pimplegayan village. There we would see the village potter making a pot on a primitive wheel turned by hand. While the clay is whirling around on the wheel, the potter is shaping the pot by whacking it with a wooden mallet. As his right hand is visibly raining these blows on the outside of the pot, his left hand is inside the pot, unseen, silently supporting and upholding it so that it does not break. Thus, although we do not feel or see him, Baba is always at our side. Baba is intimately connected to us. He is not separate and remote. And he endures suffering that we may awaken to the knowledge that he and we are one in reality. We may think that as God, Meher Baba does not suffer as we do, but he is God descended into man form that he might become as one of us, putting aside his infinite bliss and embracing suffering so he may alleviate humanity's suffering. He experiences our suffering, and as Erich has said, while we are suffering, that is the greatest opportunity. He gives us to live in him at that time. Suffering is there, body does suffer, but it doesn't somehow or other get registered by our awareness, because our awareness is in him at the same time. Erich has further said, what Baba wants is when suffering comes to our lot, to the extent that the body can endure, we should embrace it in him. Live in him at the time, and that's the greatest opportunity that he gives us to live in him at that time. So suffering is there, body does suffer, but it doesn't somehow or other get registered by our awareness because our awareness is in Him at the time. It's way beyond. It's not cheerfulness. The natural reflections will be that you will be suffering and crying, and you will be bearing it patiently. At the most, that you will do this, you will just bear it without making a sound or anything of the sort. But you are always in tune with Him. So you don't suffer actually as others suffer. The suffering is witnessed by others, but inwardly you don't suffer because you are in Him. You are living in Him at the time. So when such a person, such a soul suffers and lives in Him, that is His compassion, true compassion. So when you really call out to Him, well, He is there. There is a difference in calling Him out and feeling that you really called Him out. Even if you were to fall thousands of feet, it would appear as if one fell on His lap. It's an air cushion there. There is no hurt. That is His compassion. But when does the person call out spontaneously and truly? When he is definitely going to dedicate himself throughout his lifespan remembering Him. Only then that call of great yearning and longing comes out. His compassion is that He would do His very best to get anyone closer to Him and to get him out of the rut of these constant incarnations. Not relief from suffering, but more suffering. That's His real compassion. It's the only good weapon He can utilize in order to make us turn towards Him and face Him. Baba suffers universally through His universal form. Yes, as man we suffer, and we can either take joy and cognizance in the suffering that comes our way, or we must endure suffering in one form or another until He gains our attention and makes us call out to God to be with us. He is everlastingly with us, but we are not conscious of it. Each painful moment is, I believe, beloved Baba knocking upon the door of our heart, saying, here is another opportunity to uncover the hidden depths of the unconsciousness. As beloved Baba points out, we act and react in accordance with the prompting of the mental impressions and the stimuli of the environment. The only way to stop the thrust of those impressions is to continually awaken the heart with love for Baba, to stop and think of Him between the arising of the impulse and the translation into action. As Baba said whilst I was driving him, it is impossible to stop thoughts. They are there in the mind and arise spontaneously. It is almost impossible to stop thoughts becoming feelings. But it is possible to stop those feelings becoming actions. In the space between feelings and actions, He has given us the chance of freedom from the compulsion of mental impressions. That moment can be a moment of freedom, but the price is the suffering that comes from the denial of the power of the mind. It is not easy to deny the desires of the mind, particularly lust, greed, anger. And as Baba has said, the temptation of money, fame, power and leadership. But the remembrance of Baba and the feeling that wells up from that remembrance can create the strength to overcome the urges of the mind. And that response is helped by reading his messages, picturing him in form and features, repeating his name, and listening to stories of his life. A beautiful example of suffering endured and transcended is the story of Homi Satta, the father of Roshan Kerawala. There lived in Ahmednagar a Parsi family named Satta on a large property known as Akbar Press. There were 5 brothers and 4 sisters, and they all became devoted to Baba. Homi was one of the 2 Satta brothers who first had contact with Baba in the early 1920s. He was a locomotive driver on long runs such as Bombay to Delhi, and it is recorded that people would set their clocks by his departures and arrivals. So meticulous was he in his duties. He married, and although both parents were apparently healthy, their first 3 children developed terminal illness by the age of 7. Then, when the 4th and last child was 5 years old, the mother died, left with 4 children and 3 severely crippled. Homi retired with a retirement fund sufficient to give a monthly pension covering his expenses. This was in 1942. All through this period, and indeed throughout his life, he was also known as Jolly Mama, meaning jolly uncle, because of his constant cheerfulness and lively sense of humour. In 1947, his entire retirement fund was lost when the Muslim company holding the money moved to Pakistan with the partition of India into 2 nations. At that point, beloved Baba called Homi to Meherazad, and while he was taking off his boots to go into Mundley Hall, he heard Baba say to the Mundley, "Homi has won and I have lost." Homi was shocked and hurriedly came in and exclaimed, "Baba, why are you saying that to me? If I have done something wrong, please forgive me." Baba assured him that he had done nothing wrong, but repeated what he had said first. Then he went on, "See, I took away your very young wife, and you did not complain to me. I gave you 3 crippled children, and you did not complain to me. And now I have taken all your money, and you have 4 children still to care for. Still you do not complain to me. Now you have nothing, so what will you do?" "Baba, I always felt in my heart that all belongs to you. You have given and you have taken away. I know you will never let me down, and that you will provide us all with whatever is necessary." Baba then turned to Sarosh, who was sitting under the window where Erich sat for so many years. "You have a big business. From tomorrow, Homi will work for you, and you will pay him 150 rupees per month." This was the sum that Homi had been receiving from his retirement fund. "He is a most honest man and will take good care of your business." Homi began working for Sarosh accordingly, leaving the house at 7 a.m. and returning at 6 p.m. Another story that comes to mind of suffering and of the joy that can lie within the suffering It is that of the old gardener of a house in which Baba stayed during the new life. His wife had died, and since then he had lived the life of a sadhu. His needs were simple, and he ate very little, usually just boiled rice, which he cooked himself. Although he had a small hut, at night he slept in the open on a cot with only a thin cotton sheet covering him. Arising at 4 a.m., he sat singing Ram, Ram, Sita Ram, no matter the freezing cold of the morning. Hearing this, Baba woke the women Mandali to listen to this singing of the Avatar's name. And although sleeping, they rejoiced in the sound of his name. Then during the day, the old man carried out his duties with Ram's name always on his lips. Later in the morning, he took his bath near the well, pouring bucket after bucket of cold water over himself in the freezing weather, with only a light covering around his waist and a cotton cloth over his shoulders. One day, Baba sent Gava to find out if the old man needed anything. But no matter how she pressed him, he answered that he required nothing, and that Thakurji, which actually was another name for Krishna, gave him all his needs. It appeared that that night was extremely cold, and yet the gardener slept as usual on his cot in the open, with only the cotton sheet over him. In the morning, Baba sent Gava again to the old man, saying that a friend wanted to give him something. Gava pressed him again, asked for something, anything. He eventually asked for a box of matches. Baba said, "All right, we must call him. I want to give him a blanket." So he was then taken to Baba, who asked him, "Why only a matchbox? You must ask for something more." "But Sahib, I don't need anything more. Thakurji, give me everything." Baba persisted. "I want to give you prasad, a gift from me. Take this blanket and a box of matches." The old man was deeply touched that Baba had personally given him the gifts and said, "I am blessed. These are a gift from Bhagwan," that is God. It was noted that during the whole exchange, the old man gazed at Baba without looking down at his presence even once. Although he was not told of Baba's identity, it was as though he was unconsciously acknowledging Baba's divinity. Erich suffered for his beloved God-man, as Peter did for Jesus Christ, as indeed did every right hand of God. Yet Erich said, "Whoever has lived with Baba, all they would want would be to be with him again." It was not a life of fun, but it was a life of joy. And it seemed in listening to him saying this, that little word joy reflected the whole of his life with his beloved Baba. I am reminded of St. Francis explaining to Brother Leo wherein lies perfect joy. "And if he, the porter of the monastery, refuses to open and forces us to stand outside all night in the snow and rain, hungry and frozen, then if we bear such ill treatment, abuse and dismissal patiently and calmly, without complaint, humbly and charitably thinking that the porter recognizes us for the wretches we are, and God moves him to denounce us, write down, Brother Leo, that here is the source of perfect joy." And St. Francis went on, above all the graces and gifts which Christ gives to his friends is that of conquering oneself and willingly enduring sufferings, insults, humiliations, and hardships for the love of Christ. For we cannot glory in all those gifts of God as they are not as, but God's. As we said earlier, we must not think that because beloved Barbara is no longer in the body, we are not subject to his taunts, tests, and challenges. He is infinite consciousness, and particularly at present is infinitely active, strongly affecting every aspect of his creation. And the stronger the conscious connection of the individual to him, the more he will provide taunts, tests, and challenges to that individual. Yet the more the individual seeks to serve him by trying to live his message in the midst of an active life, seeking to be true to the trust he has reposed in one, the more the individual will feel his presence and feel his pleasure in the efforts being made out of love for him. As Erich expressed, it is true that the body does suffer, but when we suffer in him, somehow we do not suffer as others do. They may view our suffering on the surface, but inwardly we are living in him, and the experience is not the same that others think they are watching. Therefore, when we suffer but live in him, we bear witness to God's true compassion. His words, given out when in the body, can equally apply now. I may scold you as much as I like, but if your conscience tells you that you've done your best, then don't lose your temper, nor be depressed, however much I criticize and taunt you. These prickly words have some great motive behind them. Henceforth, swallow your thoughts and suffer everything quietly. You should not be annoyed, but remain in a good mood and be cheerful despite your reeling brain. Your very wrath shows that you still lack something in carrying out my wish. However I may taunt, hurt or harass you, bear it like a stone and be conscious that you are serving me. To one man he said, you are lucky to have so many hardships. Terrible suffering is the sign of happiness and peace to come. Great heat denotes the coming of rain. Great suffering and intense sorrow indicate that happiness is about to dawn. Anything beyond your capacity will necessarily change your capacity, because so long as everything is within your limits, you don't know what is beyond them. Yes, to have a body is to suffer. Yet I am reminded of words from the Upanishads that the three greatest blessings one can have in life is to have a human body, a longing for God, and to have a perfect master. This in turn reminds me of a story from Sufi literature. 3 young Sufis were condemned to death by the Sultan for heresy. One stepped forward, asking to be beheaded first. The Sultan was amazed and asked why a man in the prime of life should seek death so eagerly. The Sufi replied that every moment in life was precious because it could be spent in remembrance of the beloved. And he wished to give his brothers the extra moments of life by dying first. One moment in this world is better than 1,000 years of the next world, because this is the place of service, and that is the place of proximity, and proximity is gained by service. The Sultan was so impressed by the young Sufi's love for God that he pardoned the three and said, "Ask a boon." They replied, "The only boon we ask of you is that you should forget us, and neither make us your favourites, nor banish us from your court, for your favour and displeasure are alike to us." The Sultan wept and dismissed them with honour. Yeah. Perhaps I could mention. I know that. I don't know. I find it pretty solid stuff, but if you're still up to listening, I'll tell you some of the particular things that I recall in 1967, particularly. Baba, as I've said, as I've described many times, how he would arrive, carried over from his bedroom, from the veranda of the house, to the back door of Mundley Hall, and after getting down with his hand on either Francis's arm or Erich's arm, he would walk slowly. I think you may have seen some of his sandals. The right one was built up to that extent. And he would walk up and down slowly. As I've said, it was never ungraceful, but it was the walk of an old man. And he would walk up and down 3 times, and then in sitting, then the Mundley sat down, and the neck brace was put on, which lifted his chin, held his neck, which was so obviously so damaged. I have no idea of the details, but you can imagine when he bowed down, touching the feet of, what was it, 10,000 sadhus and sannyasis and so many others, constant, or bowing down as he did, and the neck brace would hold his head and his neck, support them, and his skin was like white parchment. Although when I kissed his cheek on his birthday, it was like it was white like parchment, but it was that incredible quality, like a newborn baby, that it sort of had no substance. I mean, it was, and there was some sort of a fragrance about it that was not like, it didn't have perfume with it, but it was something quite special. And then on his birthday, I remember how he was, and that was when I kissed him. During the morning, as we were reading, letters and cables and or Erich was, messages of birthday greetings, suddenly somebody came in and said to Baba, which of course I didn't understand at the time, but it was the fact that the old cook of Meherazad, who had transferred to Meherazad and was cooking there, despite Baba saying, don't do it, again this year, he walked from Meherazad, an old lady, an old woman, walked from Meherazad to Meherazad in order to greet Baba and wish him happy birthday. And I can remember Baba sort of like she's done it again, a little expression, and so the neck brace came off, and it was amazing the change. I saw. It reminded me of what Eric said. You know, I said in the beginning of Baba Darshan program, Darshan, not behind the door. I saw how Baba's face. It's almost as though it got a bit of colour, the cheeks, as though it took shape, which, in a way, that of course it made the old lady happy, and Baba spent some time with her. And while he did, he sent Francis and I out to have a smoke. Funny the things you remember. Well, it was all in language that we wouldn't have understood, and anyway, I don't know, but not that it mattered to me, but obviously Baba, I think, must have given Francis the opportunity every so often because he smoked, and that was one of the occasions. Now, when I remember, that's what he would do for us when he allowed us to come and see him in those darshan programs, or when he visited Australia, how he would change for us, but just with the close men Mandali, you saw how I didn't realise then. That's one of the things that of course how I wrote that is that it's only now that I remember, and I think, oh God, how he put up with me for 14 days. Every day he would come despite that his physical condition, which I just got a hint of at times, and particularly on occasions when I remember we were outside Mandali Hall. I can't remember now what we did, but we'd gone out of Mandali Hall, Baba supported, and we went somewhere, not far. And then we came back, and again, a memory which is again vivid with me is Baba, again with his hand on Francis's arm and walking slowly. I'm watching the back of him walking slowly towards the door of Mandali Hall prior to, with difficulty, taking the steps up.